Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Teaching to Transgress speaker series. My name is Yasmin Jabal, and I am I work as the Associate Director of the Center for Teaching and Learning here at Queen's University. And before we start, I would like to acknowledge that Kingston, the city I am joining you from today, and Queen's University, my place of work, occupy the territories of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, a territory that is governed by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, a treaty that committed these nations to share the territory in peace, friendship, and respect, with each nation maintaining its distinct sovereignty, and where all newcomers are invited into this treaty and in the spirit of those obligations. You will notice that I say that Queens and Kingston occupy these territories. They don't just sit on these lands, as this process has not been neutral, nor has it been devoid of violence. And as we think about our role and responsibilities to this land and to Indigenous peoples, I wanted to take a moment to share with you the 2022 status update on reconciliation's calls to actions and accountability by the Yellowhead Institute that was edited by Eva Jewell and Ian Mosby. And Caitlin will be sharing the link directly onto the chat. As you will see in the image on the right, in the 7 years since the TRC Commission of Canada released its 94 calls to action, only 13 calls have been completed. According to the authors, at this rate, it will take 42 years or until 2065 to complete all calls to action. And quote, too much has been focused on symbols and structures. Not every call to action requires Canada and Canadians to make the kinds of lasting, permanent, and structural changes necessary to transform the relationship substantively. Some calls to actions, the authors say, are symbolic, while others are structural. And Canada is choosing to complete these symbolic calls with expediency while neglecting the structural changes called by the TRC, end quote. And so in this moment, I really urge you to read this report and consider, while reading it, why it is that the legacy calls to action that really center structural changes are the ones that are being neglected. This speaker series is inspired by scholar, educator, and activist Bell Hooks' critical work on liberatory practices and pedagogy. In her book, Teaching to Transgress, Education as the Practice for Freedom, Bell Hooks encourages us to think of the classroom as a space to transgress boundaries, a space that connects the quote, will to know with the will to become. To her, engaged education is a practice for freedom, and the classroom a space where liberatory practices can be imagined and rehearsed. Inspired by her work and her legacy, the Teaching to Transgress speaker series features radical thinkers, practitioners, and pedagogues to foster the exchange of critical and innovative pedagogies and teaching practices. Please note that this session will be recorded and that the chat, video, and sound will be turned off until after when we open it to the Q&A. It is my immense pleasure and honor to introduce you today to Dr. Özlem Sensoy. She is a professor of social justice education in the Faculty of Education, the inaugural director of the Cassidy Center for Educational Justice, and associate member of the Department of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, and an affiliated faculty member with the Center for the Comparative Muslim Studies at Simon Fraser University. Her primary field of research is social justice education. Her research examines the opportunities and barriers inherent in advancing a more equitable society through social justice education. Dr. Sensoy studies this in two ways. First, by analyzing how inequities are reproduced in social institutions such as schools, media, policing. And second, identifying constructive interventions to interrupt these inequalities, such as thinking critically about knowledge, pedagogical approaches, and political activism. Dr. Sensoy teaches courses on social justice education, critical media literacy and popular culture, and anti-oppression theories. Her research has been published in journals including Radical Pedagogy, Harvard Educational Review, Gender in Education, and Race and Ethnicity in Education. A few of Dr. Sensoy's articles will be posted in the chat. Thank you, Caitlin, for that. And today's presentation is titled Microactions, Moves in Research, Teaching, and Service that Can Shift Equity Creeds to Deeds. Dr. Sensoy, thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate it.
Let me do the standards of unmuting and checking that folks can hear me. Excellent. Thank you for the thumbs up. And also sharing, because as there we go. Hang on. Okay, now I'm ready. Can you all, you can hear me and you can see the screen, I think. Excellent.
Yes, we can.
Thank you, Yasmin. Thank you, everyone, for gathering for this presentation and spending your time listening to me talk a little bit about some of the recent work I've been doing. I want to thank Yasmin and her colleagues at the Center for Teaching and Learning at Queen's for inviting me to take part in this fantastically inspired Teaching to Transgress series. It's really a pleasure. I wish we could all be sort of in a room together and have the energy in a common space, but we'll make Zoom do for now. So thank you all. I'm joining you today from the unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples on the west coast of British Columbia. I am in Richmond, the traditional lands of the Musqueam Nation, and it is really an honor to be with you all today. The title of the talk, I modified it a little bit because I wanted to, I was making a list of the microactions. This is a new project I've been working on. So I'm going to share with you today 5 specific moves that I think can productively shift equity creeds into deeds. And hopefully one of these might be inspiring or informative to you in your own practice, in your own location, as you think about what teaching to transgress looks like in your academic unit or in the educational environment that you live and work in. So let me start. There's a quote by Howard Zinn, historian Howard Zinn, on the slide. We don't have to engage in grand heroic actions to participate in the process of change. Small acts, when multiplied by millions of people, can transform the world. Howard Zinn, this was from his very well-known work, You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train. And this has been sort of inspiration for this microactions project that I've been working on lately. So most people would agree that one does not need to be an engineer to drive a car more competently, or a chef in order to make a great meal, or a tennis pro in order to improve one's game. Yet while many people agree with the core values associated with equity and believe in the importance of dismantling racism, in protecting gender and sexuality diverse peoples from violence, in correcting for the historical and ongoing harms of colonialism, many of us are still hesitant to engage in actions that could improve our equity game. There are a few reasons for this. Among them is a fear of doing more harm to already vulnerable or marginalized peoples. As well, action for equity can be difficult to imagine outside of mainstream images we see of activists on the streets dangling from trees or lying down in front of traffic on bridges and highways. When I ask my own undergrad students what they think of activism, these are usually among the most common things that come up in class discussion. These images of perhaps what we could think of as macro actions, as well as the sheer magnitude of social injustice, can easily make one immobilized in the face of it. For the past few years, I've been instead focusing my thinking on microactions. What are the seemingly small, everyday practices, habits of thought, and changes that we can each practice that can up our equity game, and in fact be those small acts that ripple out in productive and helpful ways to improve societies for more of us? So yes, the first issue most of us are confronted with when thinking about how social injustices work is to feel overwhelmed by the magnitude of them. I sometimes describe this as the fire hose of problems that comes at you when you start to think about where problems are, especially when I work with teachers or administrators in school settings, and all the layers and layers of issues that can seem like a fire hose against which you need to protect yourself. Additionally, where we hold privilege, we can be burdened by ideas such as, why didn't I learn about this sooner? What can I do? How can I help? And on the other hand, as folks who might carry minoritized identities, not acting is not an option. So standing in front of that fire hose is not an option. It's my life, not just an intellectual exercise. And so this fire hose of equity matters includes social issues, racism, colonialism, sexism, homophobia in their complex as well, historical as well as current realities, and alongside of divergent political priorities and ideologies. Oops, go back, there we go. And even when we do commit to act, there are additional barriers. One of the most common discourses some of you and I hear is, well, just tell me how to do it. I get that it's a problem. I get that inequity is real. I get that racism is real. Why can't you just tell me how to fix this? And this is sometimes rooted in perceptions that we do get the what, that we do understand how racism or colonialism work in their complexity. And I have a photo of Serena Williams here as an entry point to help think about what's involved in understanding that you get tennis or you get an issue like racism or colonialism or Islamophobia. For a pro like Serena, for example, she likely doesn't use the same formula in the exact same way in every situation. She makes contextual decisions based on a whole host of factors that might include things like things she might have control over, such as how she feels that day, her health status, what she knows about her opponent, the venue, the type of court she's playing on, as well as situational opportunities and barriers that arise in the moment. And so telling you just how to do something like play tennis or become a pro involves a different way of thinking about what becoming good at something means, what becoming more competent at practicing equitable or equity advancing everyday practices, what that looks like. As well as the urgency, as well as the perception that all that's needed is getting the right information about how to do something, there are additional barriers to action, tell me what to do, tell me what tool to use. The same tool, such as a knife in this sort of dramatic example that I have on the screen, can be doing very different work in very different contexts and situations and circumstances. And so the tool itself isn't going to result in an equitable outcome, no matter what our intentions might be. The impact of it is predicated on the historical and situational circumstances that are at play in that moment. In addition to these, sort of the desire for tools, what are the right tools to use and how will I learn what those tools are? There are additional feelings that can act as barriers. For example, the urgency of issues as they emerge, especially in institutional contexts. Those of us who work in universities will know that when there's an EDI initiative or an equity hire or a discussion that comes up, institutional machinery can seem both extremely slow, but also quite urgent in this sort of act now or lose the momentum kind of emergence in an institutional moment. There can be feelings of guilt. This can be white guilt or other forms of privilege that can become immobilizing for some people who don't want to even think about what privilege and oppression mean because it's too hard. And of course, both internalized privilege and internalized oppression have a part to play in this. Minoritized people will just be sick and tired of being the minoritized voice on any sort of the tokenistic representative. There might be pressures from bosses or administrative leadership, those wanting quick results. So what do the quick results require? For historical, ongoing, situational, and complex issues. As well, there might be pressure from communities that we belong to who see us as the one who has a role, has a voice, and so carries some responsibilities to make space for others, to be a voice for others. And all of these can serve as barriers to action, to engaging in equity. And so working towards equity can often look like the IKEA car meme. Some of you may have seen this. If IKEA made a car, it might look something like this. And so it's thinking about equity or addressing inequity can often feel or be like this IKEA car meme about managing volume. There are many parts requiring a great deal of expertise and understanding before the car can even get moving. Before we can get going, we need to have all of the parts in the right places. And so we are avoiding action until all the pieces are in the right places. That might be great, but this, as you can probably sort of guess, leads to not only a lot of stalling out, but waiting around, nothing getting done until everything is in the right place. Everything is in the right place, in the right order. Alternatively, addressing equity can seem like the chocolate runway, about managing urgency. So some of you might recognize this is from the I Love Lucy show. This is an episode when Lucy and Ethel decide to get jobs, and they go to the local chocolate packaging factory and quickly find themselves in over their heads as they are supposed to be helping to package these gourmet chocolates as they come down the runway. But what did Lucy and Ethel get wrong if we sort of think about this from an equity perspective? First of all, it was clear that they underestimated the task that was at hand and overestimated their skills. They assumed that loving the topic meant having the skills. So I am committed and feel passionate about injustice and remedying it. That doesn't always, well, maybe I can say that doesn't ever translate into having the skills. And it doesn't mean it isn't a critical component of doing the equity work. But there's a difference between developing skills and having a passion for something. If you have a passion for global education or internationalization, that doesn't mean you have the skills to attend to the complexities of what those international students might be facing as they come to your program, for example. They also didn't ask for help when they realized they were in over their heads. In fact, they tried to problem solve in ways that actually made the problem worse. Um, the other part of this, among, we could go on and on about all the things that they got wrong, but the other part of the analogy that works for my purposes, sort of thinking about this as an equity, through an equity lens, is that the conditions, the circumstances of the factory, the institution, didn't allow them a pressure release valve. It was succeed or get fired. And so it wasn't just the decisions they made that resulted in the problematic dynamics in managing the urgency of the chocolate runway, but they also didn't have the kind of pressure release valve in the institution to slow things down, to push pause, to gain external, sort of seek out external resources that might offer them a valuable perspective on what they thought they were doing or what they thought the task was. All of these are really helpful metaphors to thinking about what our assumptions are when we take on any kind of equity remedy task, especially in an institutional setting like a factory. So why it's not so simple as just developing and teaching a list. Circumstances of social inequity are dynamic, they're contextual. Think of the analogy, are you standing too close to someone else? Well, it depends, right? It depends that many of us can relate to. Am I on the bus? Is the bus crowded or is it not so crowded? Am I standing on the bus with someone I know and love and trust, or with a stranger who got on the bus after me? Am I with my sweetheart? And depending on the context, the other factors at play, these are all a part of what is going on and what needs to be fixed. Second, one size does not fit all. What worked here and now might not and probably won't work there and then. Also, we are complicit. What we think we get and what we hope, our good wishes and good intentions aren't necessarily enough to make us a good cook. I might have very good intentions walking into the kitchen, flinging open the cupboards and putting all of my favorite things into a pot. But there's no guarantee and probably a good likelihood of failure that that's going to result in a tasty meal that others will enjoy, much less nourish them. And finally, dynamics of oppression are historical, cultural, political, and involve power. So change is resisted because the oppressive dynamics seem natural and normal. They are uncontested norms of neutrality. And I'm going to say a little bit more about this neutrality piece. Most folks who are, and those of you who are here, I believe, have a foundational commitments to advancing equity in the spaces you work in. And you might have encountered this already. Most perceptions of folks will think they don't have power because our ideas of power involve standing at the top of the authority ladder, having a large budget, access to decision making, and very sort of externally visible manifestations of power. But there's also a type of power, ideological, hegemonic power, that's about normalcy. What is normal in our space? And that's a much more challenging kind of power to see, much less uproot. So how do we start with micro actions? So while most of us can conceptualize, or most conceptualizations of equity is organized around the volume and urgency issues, the volume of work and issues that need to be addressed, and the urgency of them. Meaning actions are either gargantuan, they're too big for one or two people to take on, or they're an emergency. They require urgent care, an urgent remedy. While there are urgent needs, of course, and many folks working to study and remedying large-scale problems at our institutions, there are lots of other things that others among us can do. And that's what microactions, or the exploration of microactions, is intended to get at. Not to dismiss that there are urgent issues that arise for any or many populations of folks, or large-scale problems that people are trying to work together to remedy. But there are these everyday ways that we can do our work, our everyday work, that can actually advance, I believe, can help to advance equity. So I'm going to talk about 5 specific micro actions that might help. These might not all make sense to you in this moment, but maybe one of them will, and it might be a useful starting place for your own study and context. First, shifting our thinking about equity from equity as a belief system, something we believe in, as content. So as those tools, what's the equitable lesson plan and the materials, as an attitude, good versus bad people. We just need to make sure a lot of workshops and lessons in anti-oppressive practices are about, putting yourself in someone else's shoes. That's getting at this attitudinal piece. Or equity as a belief system. We must convince others that equity is something that will be good for us and them. To instead thinking about equity as a lens of inquiry. We are always looking at the world in a particular way. That is that unnamed normalcy that has the cultural fingerprints of some bodies, but not everybody's. So how can we think about equity as a way we see the world, as a way we approach our curriculum, as a way we think about our practice? How can we think about equity as actually a scholarly, evidence-based practice, not political correctness or cancel culture or any of these really popular discourses that are like wrenches thrown into the machinery? And also equity as an approach, as a strategy for addressing injustice, not as a finished act. Now that we have equity, we're finished. But how can we sustain equitable interactions as a way to be in diversity, not a what to do with diversity? So as a way, how can we think about equity as a way to be in diversity together, in a diverse democratic society together? So that's the first micro action, is shifting our thinking. As you, for example, if you are an instructor, how does the notion of believing in equity, you are someone who believes in anti-racism, how is that bubbling up in your faculty meetings? And how can you, in that moment, sort of shift to, well, what's the belief system that we're using now to think about this problem that we're thinking about remedying, such as online learning? Now I think all institutions are trying to figure out, how do we get people back, how do we get students and faculty and staff back on our campuses? And the idea of thinking about different bodies and risk factors and circumstances that people are bringing with them, when we approach those problems as, well, we just want to, because being nice people think about belief system, equity as a belief system, and you're either a good person because you want to give everyone flexibility, or you're a bad person because you want to force everyone back into the building, for example. Thinking about equity as an approach forces us to consider well, what's that baseline way we're thinking about what it means to bring people back into the building, right? Why, what does the commodification of labor look like in our environment? How is work conceptualized in terms of hours of the day or numbers of people sitting in offices? Those are the normalized, neutral ways that we think bringing everyone back into the building will be fair and objective. And that the equitable way to think about it is actually just a set of values, ideologies that you're pushing on everyone because that's your thing, Özlem or Yasmin or whoever is the pusher in their academic unit. So this is the kind of, it's a micro action, but it's a practice. So this is Serena Williams running her drills. I'm sure she runs lots of drills and doesn't just simply get on a court and play tennis every day, right? She's doing lots of habitual pattern building behavior. When the dentist tells me I got to brush for 2 minutes, oh, there's a lot of strategies on how to practice that endurance. And this is one of the micro actions that I think is worth practicing. So how do I see and advance equity, as an approach, just like any other approach we have, and come to terms with the not neutral, that what we're doing in the building in any case is not neutral. Second microaction that we can practice, seeing people as, sorry everyone, I just had a, can you see that? Okay. Seeing individuals, seeing people as both members, as individuals with unique perspectives, unique lives, unique experiences and histories, but also as members of socially constructed groups who, so this resource, it's available online. If you just look up Margot Adair and Sharon Howell, it's old, but I think it's really fantastic. It's called Tools for Change. There are a lot of institutional sort of checklists and resources that they have available on an archived website. You should be able to find it online. It's pretty easy to find, and it's a wonderful resource from some colleagues from the Seattle area from the mid to late 90s. So this is what they write in the Tools for Change handbook. When members of oppressed groups have to choose between individuality and group identity, it is a no-win situation. If a person chooses individuality, it becomes extremely difficult to maintain ties to their own community. They look different, but act the same as the rest of the organization. If, on the other hand, they choose to preserve their cultural identity, they find themselves both isolated in the organization and facing perpetual resistance to their claiming of cultural identity. To overcome tokenism, we need to create organizational cultures that enable everyone to claim both their individual and their cultural integrity. So this is a really important principle that is really hard, especially for mainstream dominant culture. So, this is the not all men thing. There are lots of individual men who are working against patriarchy, who are working to create gender equitable spaces for everyone. Yes, not all men. And at the same time, there is a group manifestation of androcentrism, a male-centric institutional structures that is also at the same time the reality of how social identities have worked over time. One of the ways that I sometimes ask my students to think about this, and you might like to use a version of this exercise if you have students that you'd like to practice this micro action with, the individual and group membership at the same time. I'll sometimes say, when someone sort of says Özlem, calls out to Özlem, I will respond thinking that they are talking to me in particular. but my name also carries with it a whole bunch of other details and histories that impact my experience as an individual. So for example, my name reflects a linguistic and cultural time and place. It may have been written, so in the top line, Özlem Sensoy, that's how it would be written in Turkey, in Istanbul, at the time I was born in 1972. Had I been born in 1872, it would have looked very different, like the second line perhaps, because the Turkish state didn't exist in 1872. It was the Ottoman Empire. And so those are cultural forces and historical realities that are outside any family decision-making, but they impact how your name is represented in a particular historical time and place. When my family immigrated to Canada, the diacritical marks were dropped from immigration and institutional paperwork as those were foreign to this particular time and place. And so the sound of my name changed as much as the writing of my name. I often go back and forth with, I have a very conflicting relationship with pronouns, because if I name my pronouns and write my name as either Ms. Özlem Sensoy or name my pronouns in any email signature, it cleans up a cultural mess that folks might encounter when they respond to me as Mr. Özlem Sensoy, making assumptions or revealing their assumptions about what certain letters or names in a name that they likely won't recognize would look like. Sorry, can you all hear the cat meow? Sorry about that. That's an example of urgency. I must get in, doors are closed. Why are doors closed? Sorry about that. So your names are also reflected in the professional advancements that you make. So I didn't become, hello everyone, this is the troublemaker, go away. So when I got the PhD and when we all receive our PhDs, our names reflect that group membership, right? When I got my position at SFU, my name reflected that group membership, Professor Özlem Sensoy. And so place, family, gender, language, culture, ethnicity, class, these are all just a whole list of small yet group level things that situate you in that matrix as an individual. And so for most of my students, doing some sort of a name exercise, whether it's, who changes their name and why, whose names are changed. So sometimes we might say, well, I choose to take my partner's name, or my partner and I choose to create some kind of a hybrid name. That too is a response to some kind of a social norm or a group level norm that you all are either conforming to or resisting. So making these identity interplays visible is a really important equity principle, and it's a micro action that can actually be very helpful in a professional setting. So let's imagine these are the group of folks we work with or we teach, and they come into our classrooms, and I ask you to think about, so which one of these people from the list of registrants that I have in my hand, which one is Vanessa Ma, which one is John Miller, and which one is Shanila Brock? And it's likely that the only thing that I have, the only information I can use to make inferences about who these individuals are the group level ideas that I think I know about a name like Vanessa Ma. What cultural, linguistic, historical assumptions have I learned without meeting Vanessa Ma ever? It's the first time she's come into this workplace. It's the first time she's come into my classroom. Um, and my only source of information are the group level ideas that I have about who a John Miller is. And this goes beyond just stereotyping, because we do this with all kinds of group memberships. Which one is the boss? Who is the counselor? Which one is the dentist? And what information am I drawing on to make these assumptions? Which one likes to go hiking? How do I know? Which one likes to stay at home or play with the kids? And which one works hard, right? Again, now we get into not just assumptions about what professions people might have or what hobbies they might enjoy, but also their dispositions. Who is likely to be the hard worker? Which one earns more salary for their rank? And it's this last line that, of course, sociologists and social psychologists are able to study. All of the name studies that you might know of, that research is really based on this principle of individual and group identity. When studies send out the exact same resume with two different names, it reveals information about what the reader of that resume or CV assumes about that person, despite evidence in front of them that's exactly the same as a more so-called neutral name. And so as our eyes do this kind of initial scanning, our isolation of people's group identities based on race and gender, for example, is just but culture, religious affiliation, all of those ideas are initially informed by group level ideas that we think we have, that are neutral, that we think are neutral. And so understanding this parallel between individuality and group membership can be an incredibly valuable micro action to practice. Am I thinking about this what do I know about this individual versus what assumptions am I making about the groups that I think this individual might belong to? Third principle, understanding socialization and our training into the norms of dominant culture. So socialization occurs via the family initially, and it's transmitted formally in schools, but also via popular culture, which is an area that I study. And this is this principle in equity is really about the idea that whether we agree with them or not, we all receive the rules of how group memberships are organized. And let me give you an example I share with my students. This is Cookie Monster. You all might recognize Cookie Monster, but if you don't, let me introduce you to Cookie Monster. Cookie Monster likes cookies. And if I were to objectively describe Cookie Monster in this way, if I said Cookie Monster is blue, Cookie Monster is a messy eater, Cookie Monster is large, and Cookie Monster speaks with a deep voice, I love cookies. That's usually how Cookie Monster talks. Most of my students will, and you might also, nod in agreement that these are accurate truths about Cookie Monster. But without anyone telling any toddler or small child that Cookie Monster is a boy or male or uses male pronouns, we assign masculinity to Cookie Monster, even if simply through the pronouns used to describe him, even though Cookie Monster is more of an it, I guess, as far as monsters go. But what if we changed any of these details? What are the costs for changing any of these details? What if Cookie Monster were pink? What if Cookie Monster were a neat eater? What if Cookie Monster were smaller in size, spoke in a high voice? Or what if Cookie Monster did some of these things, but not all of these things? And so again, without any person sitting a child down to say, here are the behaviors, here are the neutral things that go with the boy body or with masculinity, the associations begin at a very young age with with no malintent, and yet become normalized, neutralized, and natural. And so understanding how socialization works in our environment is really an important skill. And you can practice this skill everywhere. So when I show my students this photograph and I say, is this photograph masculine or feminine? You won't be surprised that they will 100% say this is a masculine photograph, very masculine image of a young man not wearing a shirt looking directly in the camera. Now, when I put up this photograph alongside of it and say, what about this one? Is this image masculine or feminine? And of course, I've only given them those two options. And suddenly we have a hard time excavating what the social rules are that have made the second image less masculine, at least, if not outright feminine, in the minds of my students who have never seen these images before. But we can agree, just like we described Cookie Monster as blue and messy eater and large, these two men are young. They are naked, at least from the waist up. They have a stubbly facial hair and are fit, right? And yet one is perceived as more masculine than the other. And students come up with all kinds of really complex reasons why one is more masculine and one is more feminine. Things like, you know, one is looking straight into the camera, the other one is looking away. So these are, and one has his neck exposed and is spraying perfume. It's always perfume into his neck and the crook of his neck and chest. The point is, this is a social grammar. What Stuart Hall talked about, the grammar of race. There's a grammar of group membership that we learn, and ideas are formed from that grammar. So what makes something masculine, what makes something feminine, are rules that we all learn, whether we believe in them or not. Whether you believe in it or not, I would guess that none of you are surprised at what my students say, right? Whether you agree with them or not, I bet none of you are surprised that they think of the second photograph as more feminine. And of course, masculinity and femininity are not only ideas associated with people, they are ideas that we learn about all around us. So whether we agree with them or not, when I say, is this image masculine or feminine? You won't be surprised that they almost 100% will say, this is a feminine image. And if you watch enough chocolate advertisement on TV, it tells you a lot about how the perceptions of how women eat chocolate, engage with chocolate, is a whole other crisis of femininity, or crisis of chocolate, maybe. So again, whether we agree with it or not, with them or not, these messages are all around us. And so this microaction principle focusing on socialization really is about paying attention to these media messages and starting to see them in relationship with one another. Or know that there is no neutral ground. So returning back to how do we get at subjectivity? One of my favorite, and work on excavating these hidden ideologies, hidden normative ideologies. One of my favorite Canadian philosophers in her book, What Could She Know, writes, out of whose subjectivity has the ideal of objectivity grown? So the idea of objectivity itself is a manifestation of some body's subjectivity. This is a very difficult perception to get at, but it's really critical, especially as I think of cases where he, you know, the liberal creep of the university, right? That we are brainwashing at worst our students to think in a particular way, forcing our ideologies onto students. The reality, I think, is probably closer to this principle that Lorraine Code is talking about, which is that every human study and activity emerges from what we value, what we want to look at, what we want to study. And so seeing those subjectivities is in fact, as feminist standpoint theory would tell us, brings us closer to good knowledge, that the closer we get to understanding from which positions we are looking at any object of study, we actually gain a better understanding of that object of study. In the context of our work, this can manifest as dog whistles. And I think one of the strategies that's most useful is not simply to listen for the dog whistles and know that they're coming. So some that I hear a lot, it's when I work on hiring committees, for example, focusing on EDI and targeted hiring means we're hiring unqualified or underqualified BIPOC peoples over qualified white candidates, for example. Or we don't have a race problem in my field. I hear this a lot in the maths and sciences departments, that it emerges there a lot. We don't have a racism problem. We have lots of people of color in my field. So we might hear these a lot, but do we have a plan to address them in language? So one of the great microactions that you can actually do is identify one of these subjectivities that go unchallenged. So things that neutral or not neutral assumptions, things that are masquerading as neutral, things that you hear all the time in your faculty meetings, and actually design some language, some sentences to respond to it. If any of you know, some have seen any of my writing, one of the things that I like to do is often have a yeah, but section, like a rebuttal, right? Things that I hear a lot. And that's actually my own effort to practice sort of thinking through and responding, but not with the pressure of the moment, but actually preparing a couple of sentences just as a way to put your finger on the problem of the statement and figure out how you can respond in a way that's going to dislodge that so presumed neutral and objective claim. Targeted hiring means we're hiring underqualified people of color. This will look different in each of our unique settings, but I think it's doable. And I suspect, and we can maybe sort of, we or you all in your own, I know you're all in different institutional contexts and different academic units that you work in, but I would be surprised if there weren't sort of common, sort of well-meaning devil's advocate, yeah, but aren't we just, hiring unqualified people just because they're Indigenous, just because they're women, just because they're people of color? How would you, what is the proper response for that? Not as simply a sort of a get back. There's a really funny, if anyone has ever watched Seinfeld, there's a really funny episode that I think about when I talk about this, which is when George is at a staff meeting and he thinks of a comeback, but only after the fact, some kind of that he thinks is a really funny comeback. Those of you who watch the show might remember that. So I don't quite mean that. So I don't mean a sort of a thought grenade. Somebody throws a thought grenade and you're like, yeah, I could have said that and that would have been a better thought grenade, and get everyone laughing. It's actually to think about, so what problem is this person putting their finger on? So is the problem targeted hiring? So does our academic unit now have a mandate to hire 3 Indigenous faculty members into our department? Okay, so let's then respond to that targeted hiring part of what this person is saying. Um, I wonder what our demographics have been. My understanding is that since our academic unit came into being in 1965 or 1950 or whenever it is, we have never hired any Indigenous faculty. So in the 50, 60 years of our faculty's history, we have never, so maybe we could talk about the white hiring bias that has prevented us from hiring Indigenous faculty up until this moment, when what we're calling a targeted hire is actually an effort to remedy a half century of white hiring bias. So in a shift like that, it can be helpful in a larger faculty meeting setting, for example, to not just serve as a rebuttal of the, George Costanza style, but actually to help shift the attention of what the problem is in the discussion. Here are some other ways that we can, excavating neutral discourses can be valuable. Are these barbaric? So there's this, I don't know if this was a meme or if this was an actual thing, but a couple of years ago, someone sent me this, this thing for a product called Nexi. And Nexi is basically a piece of super strong tape that you use to pull together the skin at the back of your neck so you can get a sort of a lifting effect, a tightening effect of your skin. Could we call these barbaric cultural practices? Again, that discourse, targeted hires, barbaric cultural practices, these carry ideas about what the problem is. Would we call this barbaric cultural practices? Was his honor wounded? Right? When we talk about honor crimes in a particular cultural context, would this be an example of an honor crime? Is it stalking, or is it sexy and charming and romantic? So 50 Shades of Grey is part of a series that grew out of the fan fiction of the Twilight series, which was very popular about a decade ago, I guess now. And in that, from 50 Shades of Grey, he pulls up, this is the main narrator writing her story. He pulls up outside my duplex. I belatedly realize he's not asked me where I live, yet he knows. What able cell phone tracking, helicopter owning stalker wouldn't? In a kind of humorous, playful, oh, he really must want me kind of way. Again, normalize knowledge of the kind of Pepe Le Pew who pursues Penelope, the cat, at great lengths, while Penelope says, no, 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 over and over again. And so what do we call that kind of pursuit, right? Is it romantic? Is it playful? Is it even sexy and charming? Or is it stalking behavior? And maybe someone will say, oh, you're reading too much into it. Okay, so let's look at the evidence in front of us. How much of this evidence over time can we put together? And what kind of a neutral landscape is presented? So if violence and advancement against the no is represented as neutral, who benefits from that representation? The person saying no or the person advancing? And so again, these are not, by calling them micro, I don't mean to imply that they are easy, but these kinds of, the kind of attention to non-neutral language, that all of our language and the way we talk about an issue, whether it's targeted hiring or stalking or romance, that these are all embedded with ideas about individuals, and that whether we agree with it or not, we learn these messages through practices of socialization from childhood. And the last micro action that I'll share with you is again from that toolsforchange.org website, which I think, again, I would encourage you to visit and seek out the excellent resources there. This is about shifting airtime. We could all be in the same space and having very different experiences. So for example, we might all leave the same holiday party at midnight, but have very different experiences and fears and worries walking to our cars. This is the equity idea here is that people who are in positions of privilege have certain tendencies and comforts, and people who have experienced oppression also have certain tendencies that come from a lifetime of experience. This doesn't mean that every interaction will result in an explicit racist exchange or sexist exchange, or that when there are more numbers of one or the other, somehow these discourses flip-flop. Now we have reverse racism or reverse sexism of some kind. Rather, it's about understanding that we could be in the same environment, same meeting, same classroom, having a very different experience. And seeing and understanding those differences is an important equity act. So these are some of the patterns that the Tools for Change folks have identified. So tendencies of privileged positions are to define parameters, judge what's appropriate. Tendencies of people in oppressed positions to feel awkward, doesn't trust their own perceptions, and often expects others in authority to set the agenda. In my classroom, it's not uncommon for me, even when there's a numerical minority of male students, cis male, white, especially white male students, we do small group work, and the male student takes leadership reporting out, speaking first, feels comfortable. And the women in that group will argue up and down that they wanted that they were comfortable with that decision. And so again, individual versus group level socialization is at play there. It's about learned comfort, learned access to the airtime, to taking up space. People in positions of privilege see themselves and feel capable. People who are often in minoritized positions often seen as and feel disruptive, not capable. People in positions of privilege tend to feel comfortable talking, feel comfortable interrupting, and feel comfortable raising their voice. For minoritized people, raising your voice can often be seen as anger, and so often they have to manage that perception that they might be seen as angry. People in positions of privilege see solutions to problems as promoting better feelings. We need to build community is something I hear a lot. And minoritized people see solutions to problems in action. That building community is more than a feeling. So what is it? What do we mean when we say building community? Feel good niceness or email signatures signing off kindly doesn't mean your message was kind. So again, people in positions of privilege are often unaware of hypocrisy and contradictions and things like that, where you might say kindly and sign your name, but minoritized peoples tend to see those contradictions and the hypocrisy across the levels. Again, the equity principle here is that we might all be in the same space, in the same classroom, in the same meeting, but having a very different experience and reading of what's going on. So what are the ways that we can respond to this? So we can shift what's going on in a meeting. Many of you might know of and practice yourselves strategies such as moving from large to smaller groups, whether intentional or free groups. That may or may not work all the time, depending on how small groups are moderated. Sometimes in anti-oppressive work, these are talked about as affinity groups. So if there is a certain issue in your academic unit, affinity groups around identity, social identities. So grad students together is a common one, staff and faculty. And when you have those three groups, it might be safe in the group when I'm talking to other grad students or talking to other staff. But when we share out to large group, it's probably going to be the case that the faculty members dominate that conversation, right? And say what's going on. So small groups or affinity groups have their contextual, again, this is the context dependent decision-making issue. Okay, almost last slide. Sorry, I'm just realizing the time. If you feel comfortable speaking, count to 10 before speaking. If you've spoken once already, wait for others, right? Wait your turn. Don't, if you're facilitating the meeting, don't go with the first idea or the first question. Take a few and then go with 3, 2, 1 or 2, 1, 3. Ask people to write down their questions or suggestions on note cards and pass those to the chair of the meeting. And again, yeah, but our meetings are inclusive. Everyone feels comfortable speaking up. You can't really know. Everyone feels, I might hope that, right? But again, we could be in the same place having very different experiences in that meeting. And I'll just leave you with this last thought. This is from Lessons from the Geese. Some of you might know Robert McNeish's work or the story. And he uses the geese as a metaphor for working in solidarity, not isolation, not to work alone. And the lessons from the geese are about, here are just a few that I really like. Those who share a common direction can get where they're going faster and easier than if they traveled alone. It pays to take turns doing hard tasks of leadership. So if you're working with an equity team, take turns leading and carrying the load. Honk from behind to encourage others. It's one of the things that the geese do. Those in the back honk to encourage those up front doing when they're doing the hard work. And stand by the injured. Stand with the injured. When a goose is injured, 2 others fall out of formation to stay with the injured animal until they recover and can rejoin the flock. These are great principles, I think, and I'll just leave you with that. If you can't find a mentor, be a mentor. Find someone in your academic unit. There's probably at least one person who you can work with in small spaces. Thank you again for your time listening. I'm happy to answer questions given whatever time we have, and I just want to wish those who are observing a Ramadan Mubarak. It's the holy month of Ramadan for observing Muslims, and so blessings to those who are observing.
Thank you so much.
Stop sharing. Yeah.
Sounds good. Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. You know, it's funny, sometimes I've taken out books from the library and the whole book is highlighted. And your presentation today, I feel like if I could highlight everything in the presentation would be highlighted. So thank you so much. And one of the many things that I've learned today is that maybe I will take a few questions before asking my own. So I will open it up to folks. The chat has